The late afternoon sun of May 10th cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of the Summit Creek estates. It was the kind of perfect, suburban light that made everything look clean and orderly. A visual representation of the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Arthur Pendleton, a man who had spent 40 years bringing order to the chaotic world of electrical grids, stood by his creation, a modest but elegantly engineered concrete dam that spanned the narrowest point of the creek behind his home. For 3 years, it had been a source of quiet pride, a monument to practical problem-solving. Today, it was Exhibit A. Across from him stood Amy Scott, president of the Summit Creek Homeowners Association, flanked by 2 members of the Architectural Control Committee, or ACC. Amy's posture was immaculate, her pastel blazer unwrinkled despite the spring humidity. She held a clipboard like a scepter, her expression a placid mask of professional concern that failed to conceal the glint of victory in her eyes. "Arthur," she began, her voice smooth and devoid of any overt hostility, which somehow made it more menacing. "We appreciate you meeting with us." "Of course, Amy," Arthur replied, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall man, made leaner by retirement, his silver hair neatly combed. He met her gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated, always happy to discuss community matters. One of the ACC members, a nervous man named Gary, gestured vaguely toward the dam. The committee was conducting its semi-annual walkthrough of the common areas when we noticed the structure. Amy's smile was thin, a precise incision. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on her clipboard. "That's a clear violation of common area restrictions." "Arthur." The words hung in the air, polite, procedural, and utterly devastating. It was a moment of quiet, public humiliation. He could feel the eyes of his neighbor, Robert, watching from his deck next door. Robert's basement had stayed as dry as Arthur's for 3 glorious years because of this dam. Now, he was watching its creator be dressed down like a teenager caught painting graffiti. Arthur kept his tone even. "Amy, with all due respect, this section of the creek is on my property. I've reviewed the plat maps. My lot extends 20 feet beyond the far bank." Amy did not consult her map. She didn't need to. Her certainty was absolute. The creek itself, and the drainage basin it serves, are designated as a common area drainage way in the governing documents. Any modification that affects the flow of water is subject to ACC approval, and there's no record of any such approval. She made a neat checkmark on her form. "You'll be receiving a courtesy notice outlining the violation and the required remediation." She turned to leave, her committee members trailing like pilot fish. The confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency. Arthur remained by his dam, the gentle sound of water trickling through its spillway a counterpoint to the buzzing in his ears. He had built this structure with concrete, rebar, and a lifetime of engineering knowledge. He had solved a problem, but he was beginning to understand that, in the meticulously managed world of Summit Creek, solving a problem without the proper paperwork was a greater sin than letting the problem persist. Later that evening, the courtesy notice arrived, not as a letter, but as a sterile, automated email from the HOA's management company portal. Arthur sat at the heavy oak desk in his home office, the screen's glow illuminating the lines of concern etched on his face. The room was his sanctuary, a place of logic and order. Books on electrical theory and fluid dynamics lined the shelves. Framed schematics he'd designed for a municipal power station hung on the wall, a testament to a career spent mastering complex systems. His wife, Sarah, entered quietly, placing a mug of chamomile tea beside his keyboard. She was a retired nurse, a woman whose professional life had been dedicated to managing human crises, not bureaucratic ones. She looked from Arthur's tense expression to the email on the screen. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice soft. "It's a courtesy violation notice," Arthur read aloud, the phrase tasting like ash in his mouth. Violation, Paragraph 7.3, unauthorized alteration of common area drainage. Description, construction of an unapproved dam-like structure in the common area creek bed behind Lot 74. Required action: remove structure and restore creek bed to its original condition within 30 days to avoid further enforcement action. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "Arthur, you told her it was on our property." "I did." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She claims the creek itself is a common area. I need to find the original closing documents. The plat map from when we bought the house." He looked around the office, at the tangible evidence of a life built on precision and fact. For 40 years, if a system was failing, he diagnosed the fault, designed a solution, and implemented it. The results were measurable: lights came on, machinery worked, power flowed. He had approached the annual flooding of his and Robert's basements with the same methodical mindset. 8 years of hauling shop vacs, deploying dehumidifiers, and replacing ruined carpet had been a recurring, predictable system failure. The dam was his elegant, effective fix. Now, that logic was colliding with a different kind of system, one governed by bylaws and interpretations, where the facts seemed secondary to procedure. "This isn't just about the dam, is it?" Sarah asked, her insight cutting through his technical focus. "This is about her." Arthur nodded slowly. Amy Scott had been elected board president 2 years ago on a platform of restoring property values through vigorous enforcement. In practice, this meant a blizzard of violation notices for minor infractions, a garbage can left out 2 hours too long, a basketball hoop with a frayed net, a shade of trim paint that was a fraction of a tone off the approved palette. She was a real estate attorney who seemed to view the CC&Rs not as a guide for community living, but as a weapon to be wielded. "She's making an example of me," Arthur said, the engineer who thought he knew better than the rules. "Don't let her get to you," Sarah urged. "Your health is more important than a pile of concrete." He knew she was right. His retirement was supposed to be about lowering his blood pressure, not fighting a war of attrition with a homeowners association. But the engineer in him, the part that believed in provable facts and logical solutions, couldn't let it go. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was an assault on reason itself. He was being told his solution to a real problem was a violation, while the problem itself had been ignored by the HOA for years. He closed the email and began searching his digital files for the original survey of his property. The battle had begun, and it would be fought not with concrete and rebar, but with documents, deeds, and the fine print of Summit Creek's governing documents. On May 15th, the flimsy piece of the courtesy notice was shattered. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Brenda, handed Arthur a thin, green and white envelope that required his signature, a certified letter. He knew before he opened it that the courtesy phase was over. He slit the envelope open with a letter opener, his movements precise and deliberate, a stark contrast to the thumping in his chest. Inside, the formal violation notice was printed on the HOA management company's letterhead. It was cold, impersonal, and legally airtight. It cited a different clause this time, CC&Rs. Article 8, Section 8.4.2, Unauthorized alterations to common areas. No owner shall erect, construct, or maintain any building, fence, wall, structure, or other improvement in or on any common area without the prior written consent of the Board of Directors, acting in accordance with the recommendations of the Architectural Control Committee. The letter went on to state that since the 30-day remediation period from the initial notice was now officially underway, and no plans for removal had been submitted, the board had voted to levy an initial fine of $100. Furthermore, it stated that the fine would double for each subsequent 30-day period of noncompliance. The final paragraph was the most chilling. Failure to cure this violation will result in a summons to a formal hearing before the Board of Directors to consider further sanctions, including significant monetary penalties and the levying of a special assessment against your property to cover the cost of forced removal. It was signed not by Amy, but by the anonymous Board of Directors, Summit Creek Estates, HOA. "They're fining us," Arthur said, handing the letter to Sarah. She read it, her lips tightening. "This is insane. They didn't even wait for you to respond." "It's procedure," Arthur said. Though the word felt inadequate, it was aggression cloaked in procedure, by citing the Common Area Clause. Amy was sidestepping his property rights argument entirely. She had defined the battlefield, and it was a patch of land he was certain he owned. He spent the next 2 days compiling his response. He unearthed the original plat map filed with the county when the subdivision was first developed, just as he remembered. His property line clearly extended across the creek. He wrote a detailed 2-page letter, a model of clarity and logic. He cited the official plat map, attached a copy, and explained the engineering principles behind his retention dam. He demonstrated with rainfall data from the past 3 years how the dam had mitigated runoff, preventing the very water damage that could negatively impact property values. He argued that his structure was not in a common area, and therefore, Section 8.4.2 did not apply. He sent his response via certified mail, creating his own paper trail. He expected a counterargument, a debate over the interpretation of the maps. He did not expect silence. For 2 weeks, there was no reply. The only communication was an automated email reminder that his $100 fine was due. Then, on June 1st, another certified letter arrived. It was a hearing notice. He was being summoned to appear before the Board of Directors on June 5th. The threat was no longer a piece of paper. It was a formal, scheduled confrontation. The system was moving forward, and his logical, data-driven defense had been utterly ignored. The hearing on June 5th was held in the Summit Creek Clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool. Arthur sat at a long folding table facing the 5 members of the board, who were seated at a matching table on a slightly raised platform. It was designed to feel like a courtroom, and the effect was not subtle. Amy Scott sat in the center, a picture of calm authority. To her right sat her 2 allies, a retired sales executive and a wealth manager who nodded at everything she said. To her left was Gary from the ACC, looking deeply uncomfortable, and a newer board member named Michael Chen, a young software engineer who seemed to be the only one taking notes. Amy called the hearing to order, reading from a script with practiced ease. "We are here to address the ongoing violation at Lot 74, the construction of an unapproved structure in a common area drainage way. Mr. Pendleton, you have 10 minutes to present your case." Arthur stood, his folder of documents in hand. He had prepared meticulously, creating a clear, concise presentation with diagrams and photographs. "Members of the board, thank you for this opportunity. The central issue here is the location of the structure. I'd like to begin by presenting the official plat map for my property, recorded with Montgomery County." "Objection," Amy said smoothly, not a hint of malice in her voice. "Procedural objection. Mr. Pendleton, was this evidence submitted to the board for review at least 72 hours prior to this hearing, as stipulated in the bylaws? Article 4, Section 3C. Arthur was stunned into silence for a moment. No. I brought it with me. My formal response letter, which I sent weeks ago, referenced. Referencing a document is not the same as submitting it for the official hearing record, Amy countered, looking to the other board members. The rules are in place to ensure the board has adequate time to review all materials. I'm afraid we cannot accept new evidence presented during the hearing itself. Her allies nodded in solemn agreement. Michael Chen frowned, looking down at his notepad. Arthur felt a surge of frustrated anger, but he kept his composure. Then, let me speak to the facts I laid out in my letter. For 8 years, my property and my neighbor's property experienced significant flooding. The HOA took no action. I, a retired professional engineer, developed a solution that has successfully prevented any water damage for the last 3 years. This solution benefits the community by preventing erosion and managing stormwater runoff, which is a stated goal in our community's own mission statement. He laid out his engineering arguments, explaining the principles of hydrograph attenuation and peak flow reduction in simple terms. He could see he had Michael's attention. The other three, however, were watching Amy. When he finished, Amy thanked him with a cool smile. Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. Your passion is evident. However, the issue before the board is not the efficacy of your structure, but its compliance with the governing documents. The documents clearly state that the drainage way is a common area, and no structures are to be erected without ACC approval. That approval was not sought or granted. She then opened the floor for discussion. Her two allies spoke briefly, praising the need for consistent rule enforcement. Gary mumbled something about following procedures. Michael, however, spoke up. Madam President, he said, addressing Amy, I think Mr. Pendleton raises a valid point about the plat map. If his property line is where he says it is, then Section 8.4.2 wouldn't apply. Shouldn't we at least look at his evidence before making a decision? Amy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Michael, our determination is based on the legal definition of the common areas in the CC&Rs, as interpreted by our legal counsel. We are not land surveyors. We are bound to enforce the documents as written. Now, is there a motion? Her right-hand man immediately made a motion to uphold the violation, find Mr. Pendleton in continued non-compliance, and escalate the fines to $200 per month. It was seconded instantly. Amy called for a vote. Her hand and those of her two allies shot up. Gary, after a moment's hesitation, reluctantly raised his. Michael's remained firmly on the table. The motion carries. 4-1, Amy announced, her voice betraying no emotion. Mr. Pendleton, you will receive official notice of the board's decision. This hearing is adjourned. Arthur sat there for a moment, the folder of his meticulously prepared, unviewed evidence resting on the table in front of him. He hadn't been defeated by a better argument. He had been defeated by a rulebook he didn't even know was in play. He had brought a calculator to a knife fight. He had presented logic, data, and engineering principles to a body that only cared about procedure. A procedure controlled by a master manipulator. He realized then that to win this fight, he couldn't just be right. He had to be better at Amy's own game. The days following the hearing were a blur of frustration and strategic recalibration. The official notice of the board's decision arrived, as promised, along with an invoice for the now doubled fine. Arthur knew that logic and reason had failed him. Amy wasn't interested in a debate. She was interested in total victory. If he was going to protect his home and his peace of mind, he needed more than just a plat map. He needed irrefutable evidence, and he needed to understand Amy's real motive. His first call was to David Whitman, the nephew of the former HOA president. Harold, now in his late 80s and living in an assisted living facility, had been a meticulous record keeper. Arthur had met David a few times at neighborhood barbecues. "David, it's Arthur Pendleton from down the street," he began. "You sent me some of your uncle's old files a few weeks back. I think I might need to see the rest of them." There was a pause on the line. "Arthur, I'm glad you called," David said, his voice low. "Uncle Harold always said Amy Scott had a long memory. He said if she ever came after that creek, there was more to it than just the rules." 2 days later, David dropped off a heavy banker's box at Arthur's door. It was a treasure trove of Summit Creek history, decades of meeting minutes, old newsletters, and thick binders filled with Harold's handwritten notes on infrastructure and drainage. For the next week, Arthur's office became a command center. He and Sarah spent their evenings sifting through the yellowed papers, a strange archaeological dig into the bureaucratic soul of their own neighborhood. Among the files, Arthur found a faded copy of the original subdivision plat map, the same one he had, but stapled to the back was something else, a crinkled, barely legible drawing. Along the creek bed behind his property, a dotted line was drawn with the faint letters PDE penciled next to it. He didn't know what it meant, but it was a clue. He knew he couldn't decipher this puzzle alone. His next call was to a man his lawyer had recommended, a retired county clerk named Martin Gable, who now ran a small but highly respected land surveying business. Gable was in his late 60s, with a quiet, methodical demeanor that Arthur immediately trusted. On June 15th, Gable arrived in his work truck, a vehicle filled with tripods, GPS receivers, and rolled-up maps. Arthur explained the situation, showing him the official notice, the plat map, and the mysterious PDE annotation. Gable studied the faded drawing with a magnifying glass. "PDE," he murmured. "Private drainage easement. This is interesting. This looks like a pre-development annotation. It suggests that before the houses were even built, the original landowner granted an easement." "What does that mean, exactly?" Arthur asked. "It means," Gable said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that the rights to manage drainage in that specific area may belong to the property owner, not the association. An easement like this, if it was properly recorded before the HOA was formed and the CC&Rs were filed, supersedes the HOA's authority over that piece of land. It's a senior property right." The concept was a thunderclap of revelation. If Gable was right, Amy's entire case, built on the foundation of the creek being a common area, would crumble. "Can you prove it?" Arthur asked, his heart pounding. "The only way to know for sure is to pull the original deeds and easement filings from the county recorder's office. Paper trails don't lie," Gable said. "It'll take me a few days to do the title search and survey the exact boundaries." While Gable began his investigation, the pressure from the HOA intensified. The monthly fines were accumulating. Neighbors who had once been friendly now offered tight, awkward smiles. Amy's narrative that Arthur was a rogue homeowner defying the rules and endangering the community was taking hold. Then, on June 20th, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board, a stark, white sheet of paper announcing a special meeting of the members to be held on June 28th. The agenda item was listed, "A vote to authorize the board to take all necessary action, including the levy of a special assessment, to enforce the removal of the unauthorized structure on Lot 74. Amy was no longer content with fines. She was going for the kill shot, asking the entire community to grant her the power and the money to forcibly tear down his dam. The timeline had accelerated. Gable's investigation had become a race against the clock. On the morning of June 23rd, Martin Gable called, "Arthur, I'm on my way over. You're going to want to see this." Gable arrived not with maps and charts, but with a single, certified document from the Montgomery County Recorder of Deeds. He spread it on Arthur's dining room table. It was dated 1985, 2 years before Summit Creek Estates was incorporated, and the HOA was formed. It was a formal, legally binding deed of easement. "Here it is," Gable said, his finger tracing the dense legal text. The original developer, before he sold a single lot, granted a permanent, private drainage easement to the future owner of what would become your property. It gives the owner of Lot 74 the explicit right to maintain, repair, and improve the drainage way to prevent erosion and flooding. Arthur read the words over and over, the legal jargon dissolving into a simple, beautiful truth. It's not a common area. It's the opposite of a common area, Gable confirmed. It's a private right that was attached to your deed long before the HOA ever existed. Their CC&Rs have no jurisdiction over it. Section 8.4.2 is completely irrelevant. It was the ultimate trump card, a legal fact that bulldozed Amy's entire procedural argument. The war was not over, but the tide had just turned, decisively, in his favor. He finally had evidence that couldn't be dismissed on a technicality. It was a recorded legal instrument, a fact as solid as the concrete in his dam. The midpoint had been reached, and Arthur was no longer on the defensive. He was on the attack. Armed with a certified copy of the easement deed, Arthur felt a surge of confidence he hadn't experienced since the conflict began. This was not an interpretation or an opinion. It was a legal fact, recorded in the county's official records. He drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA's management company, attaching the deed and a brief explanation from Martin Gable. He formally requested that all violations be rescinded, all fines refunded, and the upcoming special meeting be canceled. He sent it via email and certified mail, ensuring there was no question of its receipt. He expected a retraction, perhaps a grudging apology. What he got instead was a masterclass in deflection. 2 days later, a community-wide email blast went out from Amy Scott. It did not mention the easement. Instead, it announced that in the interest of full transparency and resident safety, the board had commissioned an independent engineering report on the unauthorized structure. The report, conducted by a civil engineer named Linda Wilson of Wilson Engineering, LLC, was attached. It was a glossy, 20-page document filled with complex hydrological charts and alarming phrases like potential for catastrophic upstream failure and unmitigated risk to downstream common areas. Arthur read it in disbelief. The report cleverly conceded that his dam might prevent minor flooding on his own property. But it argued that by doing so, it created a hypothetical but terrifying risk. In a 100-year storm event, the report claimed, the dam could fail, releasing a sudden surge of water that could damage downstream common area culverts and bridges. It concluded that the structure, regardless of its location, posed an unacceptable liability to the association and its members. Amy had brilliantly pivoted. She was no longer arguing about jurisdiction. She was arguing about safety. She had found a new weapon, and she was using it to poison the well right before the special meeting. She was framing Arthur not as a rule breaker, but as a reckless amateur who was endangering the entire community. The email had its intended effect. The mood in the neighborhood shifted from quiet disapproval to active concern. People Arthur had known for years now looked at him with suspicion. The story of the easement was buried under an avalanche of fear-mongering about a catastrophic dam failure. That evening, Arthur received a discreet knock on his door. It was Michael Chen, the young board member. He looked nervous. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, keeping his voice low. "I can't talk for long. I'm not supposed to be here." "Michael, come in," Arthur said, ushering him inside. Michael stood awkwardly in the foyer. "I saw your letter with the easement. I believe you. But Amy is controlling the narrative. She's not letting the facts get in the way." He hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I'm probably going to be removed from the board for this, but you need to see it." It was a printout of the minutes from a recent executive session of the board, a closed-door meeting that excluded him. Most of the page was normal business, but one section was almost entirely blacked out with a redaction marker. The heading for the section read, "Discussion of Federal Infrastructure, Grant Opportunities." Below it, a single, unredacted line mentioned pre-qualification based on documented infrastructure deficiencies. "Amy has been talking about getting federal grant money to upgrade the community's drainage system for months," Michael said. "But to qualify, you have to prove there's a significant, existing problem, a recurring one." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Amy didn't just want the dam gone. She needed it gone. His dam, by solving the flooding problem, was preventing her from documenting the very infrastructure deficiency she needed to qualify for a massive federal grant. And Linda Wilson's report, with its focus on downstream risk, was likely the first step in building a case that the entire drainage system needed a taxpayer-funded overhaul. Arthur looked from the redacted minutes to the glossy, fear-inducing engineering report on his table. He wasn't just fighting an HOA president over a small dam. He was standing in the way of a meticulously planned, potentially fraudulent, multi-million-dollar grant application. The stakes had just been raised exponentially, and the special meeting was only 2 days away. The night of the special meeting, June 28th. The clubhouse was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Summit Creek was present, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and curiosity. The air was thick with tension. At the front of the room, Amy Scott stood at a podium, the picture of composure. Beside her, a large projection screen displayed a digital countdown timer, set to 5 minutes, to ensure a fair and orderly meeting. She had announced in her email, "Each homeowner wishing to speak will be allotted exactly 5 minutes." Amy began the meeting with a polished presentation. She spoke of her duty to protect the community, the importance of following the rules, and the grave liability risks facing every homeowner. She introduced Linda Wilson, who delivered a concise, terrifying summary of her report, complete with animated graphics showing a catastrophic dam failure washing away the community's quaint wooden bridge. Then, Amy laid out the motion, a special assessment of $150 per household to fund the immediate and professional removal of the hazardous, unapproved structure. It was a brilliant move, making the cost of inaction seem personal and immediate to every person in the room. Finally, she called for comments from the floor. Several homeowners, whipped into a frenzy by Linda's presentation, spoke in favor of the motion, their voices filled with righteous indignation. Then Amy said, "Mr. Pendleton, you have 5 minutes." Arthur walked to the podium, carrying a small USB drive. He felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him. He took a deep breath, plugged the drive into the laptop, and turned to face his neighbors. The timer started its relentless countdown. 5:00, 4:59, 4:58. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm a retired electrical engineer, and I live at Lot 74. For the past 6 weeks, you have been told a story about a reckless homeowner who broke the rules and endangered his neighbors. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a different story. It's a story about facts." His first slide appeared on the screen. It was a clean, simple image of the cover of the Summit Creek CCNRs. The entire case against my structure is based on a single rule, Section 8.4.2, which prohibits unauthorized alterations to common areas. His next slide showed a high-resolution image of the official county plat map, with his property lines clearly highlighted in red. This is the official plat map. As you can see, my property extends 20 feet beyond the creek. The area in question is, factually, my private property. A murmur went through the crowd. Amy shifted at her seat, but remained silent. Arthur clicked to the next slide. It was the certified deed of easement, its dense legal text magnified for all to see. But there is an even more important fact. This is a deed of easement, filed with the county in 1985, 2 years before this HOA existed. I've highlighted the relevant passage. He read it aloud. The owner of said property is granted the right to maintain, repair, and improve the drainage way to prevent erosion and flooding. He paused, letting the words sink in. This is not a loophole. It is a senior property right that legally supersedes anything in our CC&Rs. The HOA has no jurisdiction, the entire basis for the violations, the fines, and this meeting is legally invalid. He could feel the momentum in the room shifting. People were looking at each other, then at Amy, whose placid mask was beginning to crack. He had 2 minutes left. He was ready to present his final, devastating piece of evidence: the redacted minutes, the suggestion of grant fraud, the exposure of Amy's true motive. Just as he was about to advance to the next slide, he saw Michael Chen walking up the side aisle. As Michael passed the podium, he subtly placed a small, folded note on the corner. Arthur glanced down. The note, scrawled in hasty handwriting, read, "Revealing the grant fraud will trigger an FBI probe that will bankrupt the HOA and cancel our insurance. Hurting everyone. Please, just focus on the easement." Arthur's mind raced. The countdown timer on the screen read 1:37. He held in his hands the power to not only defeat Amy, but to utterly destroy her, to expose her scheme in a blaze of glory. But Michael was right. The fallout would be catastrophic. A federal investigation would lead to legal fees that would drain the HOA's reserves, special assessments far greater than the one Amy was proposing, and a cloud of scandal that would crater everyone's property values. His innocent neighbors, the very people he was trying to reason with, would become collateral damage in his victory. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, his neighbors, people he'd shared barbecues and holiday greetings with for over a decade. He looked at Amy, a flicker of genuine panic now visible in her eyes as she watched him, waiting for the final blow. With a minute left on the clock, he made his choice. He removed the USB drive from the laptop. The screen went blank. "My neighbors," he said, his voice resonating with a new kind of authority. "The evidence of the easement is clear, and it is legally indisputable. This issue has never been about safety. It has been about a severe and costly overreach of authority by our board. I urge you to vote no on this unjust and unnecessary special assessment. Let's put a stop to this waste of our time and our money, and get back to being a community." His time was up. The timer buzzed. Arthur walked back to his seat amidst a stunned, uncertain silence. He had made a principled trade-off, choosing the health of his community over the satisfaction of total personal vindication. The vote was about to begin. The silence in the room was broken by Amy, who, regaining her composure with remarkable speed, called for the vote. Paper ballots were distributed, as homeowners marked their choices. A tense quiet descended. Arthur sat beside Sarah, her hand resting on his. He had presented the facts. He had made his difficult choice. Now, it was up to his neighbors. The votes were collected and handed to Michael and Gary to be tallied in front of everyone. The process seemed to take an eternity. Finally, Michael walked to the podium, his face grim. "The results are as follows," he announced, his voice clear and strong. "On the motion to approve the special assessment in favor, 12. Opposed, 87. A wave of applause and relieved chatter swept through the room. It was a landslide. Arthur felt Sarah squeeze his hand. He had won. The homeowners, when presented with clear, undeniable facts, had seen through the fear-mongering and procedural games. Amy Scott sat frozen at the board table, her face a pale, rigid mask. Her authority had been publicly challenged and overwhelmingly rejected. Before she could even think to adjourn the meeting, Michael spoke again. Given the information brought to light tonight regarding the board's actions on a matter outside of its legal jurisdiction, and the significant expenditure of HOA funds on legal and engineering consultations for this matter, I would like to make a motion." He took a deep breath. "I move for a vote of no confidence in our board president, Amy Scott, and for an immediate, independent audit of all HOA contracts and expenditures for the past 2 years." Another board member, Gary, surprisingly, seconded the motion instantly. The spell of Amy's control was broken. The room erupted in calls of "vote, vote." The subsequent vote of no confidence was even more lopsided. Amy Scott, the meticulous enforcer of rules, had been deposed by the very community she sought to dominate. She gathered her papers with a stony face and walked out of the clubhouse without a word. Her reign over Summit Creek Estates finished. Months later, a new sense of order, one based on reason and transparency, had settled over the community. A new board was in place, with Michael Chen as its reluctant but capable president. The independent audit, as Arthur had suspected, revealed the depths of Amy's scheme. It uncovered the pre-existing professional relationship between Amy and Linda Wilson, and flagged a series of preliminary payments to Wilson's firm for grant feasibility studies that had never been disclosed to the full board or the community. The evidence was quietly turned over to the proper authorities, ensuring accountability without the public spectacle Arthur had avoided. The new board, in its first major act, tackled the drainage issue head-on, using reserve funds. They commissioned a comprehensive upgrade of the downstream drainage system, replacing the antiquated culvert that Harold Whitman had worried about decades prior. Arthur, at the board's request, served as a volunteer consultant on the project, his engineering expertise now celebrated rather than condemned. His dam remained, now officially recognized as a valuable component of the community's integrated water management system. All fines against him had been rescinded, and the HOA had formally apologized in writing. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived for Arthur. It had no return address, but he recognized the shaky, elegant handwriting on the envelope. It was from Harold Whitman. David must have told him what had happened. Arthur opened it and read, Harold congratulated him on his victory. But the final paragraph contained a revelation that answered the one question Arthur still pondered: why? Why the intense, personal animosity from Amy? You may not know this, Arthur, Harold wrote, but Amy's father was a developer back in the late 90s. He wanted to build a high-density condo complex on the land adjacent to our community. As HOA president at the time, I led the opposition. We argued that his project's drainage plan was woefully inadequate and would cause catastrophic flooding in Summit Creek. We fought him for 2 years. And in the end, the County Planning Commission sided with us. His project was rejected. It ruined him financially. He never forgave me. And it seems his daughter never did either. Arthur lowered the letter. a profound sense of closure washing over him. It had never been about the dam. It had been about a 30-year-old grudge. A daughter's misguided attempt to avenge her father's failure by attacking the legacy of the man who had defeated him, a legacy of sound engineering and responsible community planning. He looked out his window at the creek, flowing peacefully past his small concrete dam. He had fought for his home and his principles, and, in doing so, had helped his community find its way back to common sense. His retirement was not as quiet as he had planned, but it was far more meaningful.